is now 2:15. Our next talk is going to be BB King. BB King, I like that he has an art degree. He is one of the people that have come to cybersecurity from a different field. That's something that's very near and dear to my heart. I actually got into cybersecurity because of the class that BB King had, and then my career continued to take off because of Black Hills security training. So thank you guys very much. BB King has been doing pen testing since PCI 3.0, so he's been at it a while. 1.2. What? Jesus Christ. Okay, so 1.2, BB King wrote PCI. So thank you, everyone. Please enjoy.
Thank you. Yeah, it was 2008. So I know a lot of times the security industry kind of isn't super excited about compliance requirements and things like that, and PCI gets beaten up all the time. But I love PCI because it's why I'm in security. The place I was working at the time was a financial institution, and PCI 1.2 in 2008 said, you have to start doing stuff. And they went, oh no, we better hire people. And I was one of those people. So I love PCI. It's my favorite. So I'm here to talk about Burp Suite, secret Burp Suite secrets. And before I start, how many of you know what Burp Suite is, like at all? Okay, good. How many of you have used it in the past 6 months? Awesome. Okay, cool. This is the talk for you. All right, good. So the thing about my slides is that they're no longer up. But the thing about Burp Suite is that every time I watch somebody use it, I learn something new. So when I say secret Burp Suite secrets, you probably know some of them, but maybe you don't know others. And if you ever get a chance to watch somebody else using Burp Suite, do it. Even if you think that is a new person, or somebody you think is like equivalent to your skill level. It's not about skill. It's basically about how many times have you right-clicked in a white space area and found a secret menu item. Oh, so this is me. We talked about this, PCI 1.2. I'm a web app pen tester at Black Hills InfoSec right now. I'm kind of specializing in web apps for a bit. I've done other pen tests as well. And lately I've been an instructor at Anti-Siphon Training, which is where I have modern web app pen testing. So if you're interested in learning more about how to do actual web app pen tests, we're back on the calendar in July. It's self-paced, available anytime if you want to. I got this cool tiny URL here, test web apps, if you don't want to remember the URL. And that's all I'll say about those things. So Burp is an intercepting HTTP proxy. So for those of you who don't use it, what does that mean? What is an intercepting HTTP proxy? Well, it's a proxy. So it sits between two things on the network. It sits between your applications on your computer and the network stack on your computer. It handles HTTP and HTTPS and WebSockets, but we'll just say HTTP to keep it simple. And it's intercepting, which means that you can hold a request and view or modify that request before it goes down to the network stack. Request or response, because it's in between. So the layers, the application layers up here and the network layers down here, Burp is right here. So anything on the way out has to pass through Burp. Anything on the way back in also has to pass through Burp. So you get a chance to see what HTTP traffic looks like, even if it's encrypted, which is cool. But it's not just a proxy, it's a suite. It's a collection of things. It's a group of related things. It's a suite of tools that you can use. The proxy is one of those things. You can test anything that uses HTTP with this, not just web apps. Question I get a lot is, well, I know how to test web apps. How do I test APIs? Everything's going in the API direction these days. Responses from the server is not HTML anymore. Now it's JSON. And something weird happens in the browser and turns that JSON into something you can interact with. Isn't that different? It's a little different, but not very different. And you use the exact same tools for this. It's just the syntax is different, the things you look for are a little bit different, but whatever you know from Burp about testing web apps is also going to be useful for testing APIs. These are the tools that are in the suite. There's the proxy we talked about. There's Repeater, which we're going to talk about today. We'll talk a little bit about Intruder and Extender. These are all different things that you can do. Repeater lets you replay requests. Intruder lets you replay requests a bunch of times, making small changes each time. Extender is plugins, basically, for Burp Suite. You can add functionality that's not already there. Comparer is just a diff tool, lets you take two responses and see exactly where they differ. There's an embedded browser in Burp Suite now. There's a Chromium that's built into there, which is a wonderful thing. It saves you doing some setup if you're trying to use a different browser. So if you've been using Burp Suite for a while and you haven't used the embedded browser, I suggest that you try it out. It's very simple, it's very nice. There are some things it doesn't do quite as well as an external browser that I'll try to touch on later, but it's super simple. Decoder is also an encoder. You can take data, you can URL encode things, base64 encode things, HTML encode things, and vice versa. Sequencer does some statistical analysis that nobody has ever been able to explain to me on session tokens. So if you ever tested a web app, your session token, the thing that you get when you log in, that your browser puts in a cookie and sends with every request afterwards to indicate that you're logged in and who you are, those are supposed to be long and random and unpredictable. So we want to make sure that they're long and random and unpredictable. And Sequencer will look at a whole bunch of those things, and it will look for patterns in them. And then it will give you charts and graphs and things, and it will tell you whether things are good or bad. And I've talked to people who know about statistics, and they can't explain the results to me either. So I just look for like green or red. Green is good. And there's a dashboard too. Anyway, let's start with the proxy, because this is where everything begins. Everything is built on this. So I can't show you things live. I have screenshots. This is what the proxy looks like. And you have up here, these aren't secrets yet, by the way. Up here we've got, whoops, wrong button. We've got, there we go. This is the history of what all has been going on in the past. This is what the request looks like, and this is what the response looks like for the thing that's highlighted here. So if you've never looked at Burp before, you've never looked at HTTP traffic before, you just use a browser as a browser, I hope this opens your eyes. Because what you're seeing here is this is what the browser sends when you click on something. And this is what the server sends back as a response. What do you notice? It's text. You can read text. You don't need tools, except Burp Suite. You can see what's going on with no effort at all. This is just pointing the browser to Burp as my proxy and just looking to see what's going on. If you're new to offensive security, or if you're looking for a way to get into offensive security, web apps is the way to go. You don't need anything but Burp Suite. You don't have to set up a Windows domain. You don't have to know what the permissions are and the groups are in Active Directory. You don't have to know how to set it up correctly. You don't have to have a huge lab. You can just have this. You already know how to use a web browser. And this tells you what's going on underneath. And it's a perfect step into security from wherever you are. Everybody knows how to use a web browser. Up here, this little up at the top there where it says filter. There's a filter up there, and we're not showing everything. You can see the request numbers, they jump. 797, 98, 800, what happened to 99? Well, it's a request that happened, but it was either CSS, or it was an image, or it was general binary content. So that's why it's not showing it to you. You can change those filters. That's a secret. The filters are things that people often forget about. While you're setting the filters, you're looking for something, you're trying to narrow down the collection of requests to find the one that's interesting. It's very easy to forget that you set the filters and to be watching this while you're doing things in the web browser and nothing's happening. Look in the filters. It doesn't even look like a filter bar. There it is, but it is. The other problem, everybody I think who's used Burp Suite more than once knows this. There's a button here that says intercept, and this is in the proxy history. And by default, that's turned on. So when you send a request from your browser through Burp Suite, Burp hangs onto it. And that looks like waiting. You click on a link and nothing happens. It's the thing people complain about most in Burp Suite. And something like 4 versions ago, sometime this calendar year, they actually changed that. So the default now is to have intercepting turned off by default, only if it's a new installation. If you're installing over something else, it remembers whatever you had before. But this is all it takes to start seeing what's going on in your HTTP traffic. Here's the proxy history. This is where I live. All those tools that are part of the suite, all those things that are available to you are all useful in different ways. This is where I spend almost all of my time. There's another place where you might think you would spend your time. You might think that you would spend your time in the target tab, That shows you a sitemap, all the requests that you've seen, all nice and organized and neat and pretty. That's fine for what it is, but there's no chronology there. There's no sense of what happened in what order or what request triggered another request. It gives you a great overview of what the whole site looks like, and you should absolutely look there. But this is where you want to spend your time. And this is the kind of stupid secret that you'll notice when you watch other people use Burp Suite. I sort things reversed with the newest things at the top. So you can click on any of these headings here to sort. And if you do that, then the newest thing is always going to be at the top. If you don't do that, you're constantly scrolling down to catch up with what's going on. And if you don't realize that you can click on the headers and that they will sort things for you, it's an eye-opener. It makes things a lot easier. So I'm spending my time here looking to see when I click on the web app, when I submit a form, when I do something in the form, what actually happens on the network. And then I have a fresh request I can use to send to some of the other tools. This is what's in that filter bar. So you can say, you can filter by request type. You can say show only in scope items. We'll come back to that. You can hide items without responses. You can show only parameterized requests, so things where there was something in the query string, there was a variable that went along with it. It wasn't just asking for a particular URL. All these other things are things that you can change to show you only what you're interested in seeing at the time. There is, you can filter by search term. This is a secret. This is only in the paid version of Burp. This is one of the few things that's not in the community version. If you notice that there's a particular string of interest, maybe there's a cookie that got set, maybe there's, and you want to see where that value of that cookie might be used somewhere else. If you come back here and you paste in the value of that cookie right here and go back to the proxy history, it's only going to show you requests where that string appears somewhere. That's as far as it goes. You can't say only show me where it's in the request body or the response headers or whatever, but it helps you narrow down where is that thing used. I think this thing might be interesting. I think it might be controlling access to something. What other request does this show up in? That is super helpful. And that's also one of the reasons why the proxy history stops filling up, because you forget that filter was set. So when you change these things, make sure that you remember that you've changed them. You don't have to remember what you changed, because under the little gear icon here, you can do just restore defaults. And that's what whenever I set something, whenever I want to unset it, I just do restore defaults. I don't try to remember what I changed. That's a nice time saver also. There's the restore defaults, there we go. There is a, in scope, do we get to scope yet? We'll talk about scope in just a minute. So the first rule is kind of the rule of all pen testing, and I would say of lots of life in general, is be curious about what's going on and pay attention and just believe that you can make sense of things. Believe that you'll notice when something's weird or interesting, and believe that you have the ability to make some sense out of that. Whether you know the path there right off the bat or not, just you can get there. And in Burp Suite, one way to be curious is to right-click on everything. There are context menus everywhere, and there's not like a manual that describes everything. Well, there is, but who reads the manual? Right-clicking on literally everything is where you will find treasures in Burp Suite. And beware of the defaults, like intercepting by default, what does the proxy history show by default, those types of things. Helps you notice when things change. So the target, I talked about that, the target tab. A lot of folks who first use Burp, they go here because there's a sitemap. It's pretty, it's easy to make sense of. I check that every once in a while. I look at that to confirm the scope of my test. As a consultant, I don't know anything about the web app when it comes to me to test. So I ask at one of the first meetings, I say, oh, what's the web app I'm testing? What URL is it at? And they give me a URL. I say, okay, that's the scope. I'm going to test whatever thing lives at that URL. But the people I'm talking to aren't always the developers. It's great when I can get the developers on that call. But even the developers sometimes they're too familiar with the application. They'll say, oh, it's at this URL. But if you go and you visit it and look at the sitemap, you'll notice that it's calling out to other places. It's calling out to get the Google Analytics script, or it's calling out to a content delivery network to get the JavaScript libraries. Or maybe there's www. whatever, and there's also maybe API. whatever and dev. whatever. There are other domains that are necessary for the app to function, but right off the bat, they didn't tell you those were in scope, so you're not sure should I be testing those? Is that okay to test? Do I have permission to test those? So this, in the target history, it shows you every request Burp has ever made. So you'll see all those different things that might be included in there. So do that. Make sure you're getting good coverage of that. In the target sitemap, things are either black or red or gray. Black means that it's been requested and there's been a response. Red means there was a request and it was an error response. Gray means that Burp has noticed it somewhere, but has never sent a request to it. So if you think you've explored the application and you're ready to start testing, check the sitemap. And if there's a whole bunch of gray, you've missed something. I wouldn't worry about turning all the gray into black. You don't need to send every request. If you're testing a store, for example, that would mean you'd have to put every product in your shopping cart. You're not going to do that. Just give you an idea of what's going on there. And those colors tell you just instantly what's going on there. And oh, you also notice third-party communication. So what other components are involved in here where if you just started scanning, you might be sending malicious traffic to a site that didn't agree to let you do that. And that's a bad thing to do. Did you see it was just this week, I think it was just this past week, the Department of Justice made like the most welcome clarification I've ever seen in my whole pen testing life. So you know what the CFAA is? It's the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. It's how people get prosecuted for doing things that were like totally innocent, but against the wrong organization. So it's a federal law, and the DOJ just issued a clarification. They say it's always been like this, but they're not going to prosecute good faith pen testing activities. It used to be that, like with the URL, if in the URL there's like you're retrieving a document and there's like an index number that indicates the document. There was a case, I won't get into details, but there was a case where multiple cases where people have changed that number by hand and been prosecuted as a hacker for changing a number in a URL. So this new direction from the DOJ says we're not going to prosecute people like that anymore, which is awesome. You still need to be careful. You still don't want them to come knock on your door asking questions, but it's a welcome change, in my opinion. It makes the stuff less dangerous. So scope, I kind of touched on this a little bit. So if your scope is to test Wikipedia, and you go visit Wikipedia, you're going to notice that it's already got 3 different domains. It's already got Wikipedia, en.wikipedia, and www. Well, which one's the scope? Are they all in scope? I don't know. So clarify that with your customer, with your point of contact, or if you're on the corporate team, you'll probably be able to figure it out. But when you define the scope, you're telling Burp, I'm especially interested in things on this domain or where the URL matches this pattern. And as soon as you add something to scope, Burp will do this. It'll say, you've added an item to target scope. So you could right click on wikipedia.org and you could say add to target scope. And what this is saying is, hey, do you want me to do you a favor? This is Clippy. This is Clippy saying, I think you don't care about en.wikipedia.org, and I think you don't care about www either. I think you only care about the one with just the second level domain. Do you want me to basically ignore everything else right now? No, you don't do that. This is a big mistake people make early on, is they'll click that yes button too soon. Because now what if there's an fr.wikipedia or a gb.wikipedia or another language that's just not English? There's lots of them, and you want to know about them. So I almost said don't ever click that button. I'll say don't ever click that button. You can do this manually later, once you know what the scope is for real. You'll blind yourself if you do this too soon. You will miss things, and your customer will be upset when somebody calls them with a bug bounty thing. Hey, I found this problem on a subdomain of your site. And you're like, I just got a pen test. This will keep you out of that trouble. Repeater. Repeater is one of the tools in the suite. Repeater resends requests. And my mantra, what I say to myself every time I use Repeater, is anywhere else in the tool, you can right-click on something, and a menu comes up, and there's an item in it that says send to Repeater, send to Intruder. You can send things to other tools. I send the request to Repeater, and then I immediately send it again from Repeater. So it goes send to Repeater, just puts it fills out the request tab. I click send, and then I make my changes. Then I modify that request to see how it might handle different inputs. And the reason I do that is because some requests are only good ones. And if I happen to have one of those, and I make a change to it to try to attack something, and I send that request and the response comes back with an error, I'm gonna think it's because of the change I made. But it's actually because the server says, no, no, you already sent this. So you have to do that. You have to send it again to make sure that it works. Make sure you have a good baseline. This is something else I see people skip. They'll send it to repeater, they'll make a change and then send it. Like, wait, you don't have a baseline anymore. You gotta have a baseline. This ties into there's back and forward buttons there, just like in your web browser. So in all of the repeater tabs, you can always go back to previous things you've done and forward once you've done that. And this last bit here, the minimal request is the best request. This is my opinion, but it's a very strong opinion. When you're reporting things that you find, you want to make it clear what you're reporting. And if you think back a couple of slides to what did that request look like, there were 15 request headers. And not all of them are relevant. Not all of them are necessary. In repeater, just start deleting request headers and sending until you get an error, and then go back one. You want to have as few headers in there as possible when you're showing an issue, because then that screenshot you put in the report doesn't have distracting things in it. The person looking at that is focused in on only the things that matter. And you've taken some time to rule out other things that might be contributing to the issue. So minimal request is the best request for making things clear. See all this stuff here? I'm getting Wikipedia. There's a cookie there, there's chua, there's I don't know what that stuff means. The only header that's necessary for this request to work is this: get, slash, and host. All the rest of that can go away, and I get the exact same response here. That's a clearer screenshot. If you got a screenshot here in your report and it says, hey, there's a problem here, where do you begin to look, right? Get rid of the junk that they don't need. Also, if you're ever doing a presentation online, don't use Wikipedia as your example. Because right here, it says where you are, and it's actually accurate. It gives you GPS coordinates of basically my house. So be careful. And I use Wikipedia as an example because it uses multiple subdomains, and that's the only reason. I'm not actually attacking Wikipedia. I'm just looking at what's going on, so it's cool. It's a good example for the complexity, but don't misunderstand. I'm not saying you can test Wikipedia. You can just look at the traffic. In repeater, there's a menu way up at the top where you'll never think to look for it, called repeater. And under that menu, you've got an option to URL encode as you type. So URL encoding is how you get characters that would be meaningful in a URL to be able to be transported across that without causing problems. So what? So like an equals character in a URL, that's how you separate query string names and values, right? So if you want to pass a literal equals sign, you can't do that. You have to encode it. And you have to either, like, remember what that is or use some other tool to make that happen. But URL encode as you type does exactly what it says. If you type in a character that needs to be encoded, it just does it. There's a couple different views. There's one, it used to be \r\n, now it's just \n. And that shows you the carriage return line feed characters that are at the end of each request header. The HTTP spec requires each header ends with CRLF, \r, \n, whatever. And this will make those show up so you can actually see where they are, which is handy, especially when things wrap. Sometimes you're not sure where things actually end and where it's just wrapping. And then at the bottom right, way in the bottom of the corner, you'll see the response time in milliseconds. That's useful too. Some vulnerabilities only reveal themselves in timing issues. So you can always look to see how long it took a response to come back. It's tiny, you'll miss it. The next place I spend most of my time outside of repeater is intruder, which is like repeater, but you send things repeatedly from intruder. I think it's funny, they already used repeater, so they couldn't use it again. So repeater lets you send things one at a time. You make a change, you click send, you make a change, you click send. Intruder lets you set up rules to send a whole bunch of requests in order to test a bunch of different inputs. So you're basically iterating over a set of inputs. Maybe you're trying to brute force passwords. So you find the login page, you try to log in and it fails, you use that as your baseline request, send that to intruder, set the password field to be where I put all my password guesses, feed it a list of passwords and click go, and it tries all of those passwords for that account. It's great for username enumeration and insecure direct object references, which is the thing I alluded to earlier in the comment about changing the number in a URL. If you find a place where a parameter is just like a number or a date, that's a great place to look for this insecure direct object reference thing, which basically means that if you know the name of something, the server will give it back to you, even if you're not explicitly authorized to get it. Password spraying is what I talked about, just the inverse. You would have a single password, but a bunch of users, so you don't risk locking people out. You can try those as well with Intruder. And then the secret thing in Intruder is if you right-click in an Intruder request window, there's an option called Scan Defined Insertion Points. So the insertion points are these guys, the things between these little section markers. I truncated that. My address used to be there. So that's where, those are the insertion points. And that's how you tell Intruder where you want to put all the payloads that you're going to iterate over. And this is what scan defined insertion points does. If you have all these different things defined as inputs, you can send this to Burp's active scanner and it will focus only on those things. The professional version of Burp has a built-in vulnerability scanner, which can go off the rails like any web app scanner if you just point it at the website and say, go to town. The better way to use that scanner is to choose requests that are interesting to you for some reason and have Burp scan them individually like this, using scan-defined insertion points. This is the thing that got me to right-click everywhere. How did I not see that? That is so magical. So for Intruder, you're giving it payloads. You're giving it insertion points, and you're saying, I want you to go through all these different payloads in that insertion point and send all those requests, record the responses, and let me see what they all look like. So where do you get those lists of payloads? There's a bunch built into Burp, and those are a good starting point. There's also this SecLists project that I imagine some of you are familiar with. Daniel Meisler, I think is how you pronounce his name, has this wonderful, gigantic GitHub repo of lists that are interesting for security people. So some of the lists are passwords from password breaches. Some of the lists are common first names and last names, so you can make up username combinations. Some of the lists are common directory names for directories that are found in web applications. Things like that, common content that just show up on web servers. So those are worth knowing about and looking at when you're looking for payloads. You don't have to know them all yourself. Somebody else has already collected them, you just have to find them. By default, this also messes up some tests. Burp URL encodes some of the characters in your payloads. Not all of them, some of them. It shows you at the bottom, but you have to scroll to the bottom to notice it. And sometimes you don't want to do that. For example, if you're looking for files on the server and your list of files includes directories with slashes in them, that slash is going to get URL encoded. So the server is not going to treat it as a directory separator, and all of your attacks will have been useless. So you need to pay attention to what's in your payload list and pay attention to whether it's doing this encoding or not, and whether that matters for the test that you're doing. The other is, by default, it sends an unmodified baseline request. This is what I do in Repeater. Send it to Repeater, send my request, now I have a baseline, now I make my changes and go. By default, Intruder does that as well. And that's for the same reason, so that you have in your results set the unmodified request. This is a normal response, so you have something nice to compare everything else to. Well, what if that request isn't good twice in a row? Maybe the thing that you're changing is what makes that available a second time, a third time, a fourth time. So if you send that unmodified baseline request, you could mess up the whole rest of your test depending on how the server processes it. So it doesn't seem like that's critical, but sometimes it is. And when it is, it completely ruins the whole Intruder effort. You've got to be aware of what's going on there. In Intruder, there's payload processing rules. These are easy to overlook because your first thought is, well, I have a list of passwords. I'm going to try all those. I have a list of cross-site scripting attacks. I'm going to try all those. But you can have Burp automatically modify those or generate them on the fly as you go. One example I use in my web app class is there's one way people keep track of session state now is with a thing called a JSON web token. And it's a base 64 encoded string of a bunch of stuff. And inside that stuff is readable things. And if you want to try to inject into those readable things, well, you can't do it because it has to be base 64 encoded correctly before you send it to the server. So you can't just have a payload list of all your base 64 encoded things, right? Who wants to make that? Well, you can just have your list of injection things, and one of the processing rules is to base64 encode it. So you can have it do it for you, and you can chain those rules together. You can do any number of those things in any order to get you past some trivial things that might otherwise block your testing. Another thing people overlook, and sometimes it's okay to overlook this one, but here is some of the default payload list. This is something that's built into Burp. So one of the requests is :response.write 11111. Next one is http:// your server name. What's it doing? Your email. What's it doing? Well, it's sending this to see if the web server is going to use that URL for something. Maybe it's going to send a request there. Well, your server name isn't really a server. So what you would do with these is you would use payload processing rules to find and replace this your server name string with the domain name of a server that you actually control. Now you can use this same set of payloads every time you set up a new place to listen for, and it will substitute whatever you tell it to substitute in that spot. Same with your email. This is looking to see if it's going to send an email to something you put in here. So make it an email address that you actually would receive email from. Base, same thing, that's a placeholder. You're supposed to be setting up payload processing rules to get rid of this and this and this and replace it with something meaningful to you. Easy to overlook. And that's the set of characters that are encoded by default, URL encoded by default. Rule number 2 is browser profiles. This is wonderful. This isn't really a Burp thing, but if you have multiple privilege levels in your web application and you want to see if the regular user can do admin things, the easiest way I can imagine to do that is this: have one browser profile for the regular user, another browser profile for the admin user. When you click around as the admin user and you see something you don't see as the other user, copy and paste the URL from the admin session to the regular user session. You've just done a privilege escalation attack. Did it work? You found something. So that's the easy kind of straightforward way of doing that, because in your browser, the different tabs are not different. They're the same view into the same chunk of data the browser is storing. So you can't log in as a different user in different tabs because it's the same thing. It's just a different view of it. Same with different windows in the same profile. This is how you separate those. Whole separate cookie jars, whole separate everything with the different browser profiles. So if you do one of those for each role, and then in Burp, if you set up multiple proxy listeners, so not just the default on 8080, but maybe 3 more for your other roles, and set each one of those browser profiles to go to a different listener, now you can filter by listener in your proxy history. And you can say, I only want to see stuff that went to port 8082 because that's the admin user. And from that, I want to pull out the session tokens. And then I want to find a request that went to port 8080 because that's the regular user. And I want to see if those privileges are separated well. Testing privilege escalation things, privilege separation, is difficult because you can only be logged in once as one user at a time, unless you have multiple profiles. The other thing you get from this is if you want to use the Burp Suite tools for doing your privilege escalation testing, you'll have live session tokens for every user in your proxy history. Instead of logging out as the admin and logging in as the regular user, you've just killed that admin session cookie. It's no good anymore. Now you have many alive all at once. You just pull them out of the proxy history, put them into repeater, put them into intruder, wherever you need them. And you can do all of those things without having to log back out and log back in and all of that kind of stuff, which is wonderful. It's a huge, huge time saver. Comparer compares things. It's easy to think that the browser is showing everything that's important. So this comes up when you're doing like username enumeration. I'm trying to log in and it says, oh, sorry, bad password. Oh, wait a second, does that mean that user exists? And you put in a different username and it says, oh, user doesn't exist. Now you've got username enumeration. You can tell who's a valid user and who's not. Sometimes you'll get the same looking response in the browser. It'll look the same for both of those conditions, but I've seen it, it's not at all uncommon for them to be different by, one of them has an extra space in there somewhere. It's taking a different code path on the server, right? So it's possible that the response differs in some way you just can't see when it's rendered in the browser. So comparer is a great way to compare for real at a byte level and make sure things are different. So here's comparing two requests, two responses, as words. You can compare them as words and as hex. So this one says there's 4 differences, and they're highlighted, 1, 2, 3, 4. If I change this from text to hex, now suddenly there's 26 differences. It's the same response, but the differences now at a byte level are different because there might be, like here's a 39, and oh, look, there's a 39 again. So it treats these 32, 34 as different. It's a different view of the same data. So it's useful sometimes to look at it in both ways. Number 3, I'm going to tell you not to use Burp Suite for Burp Suite. Burp Decoder is pretty great, but CyberChef is shockingly amazing. I love CyberChef. So this is Decoder. Decoder here, we've got a base64 encoded payload. We say decoded as base64, and here's your decoded value. This is CyberChef. Here's where your input goes. Here's where your recipe goes, and here's where your output is. These are all recipe things. These is just the decoding things. So in Burp Suite, these are your options for decoding. In CyberChef, these are your options for decoding. So you might want to look at CyberChef for decoding if you're using Burp Suite for that. If you want to know more about it, look, it can make QR codes. I have a whole talk on CyberChef because I love it so much, and that QR code will take you there. Rule number 4, extensions, we touched on these a tiny bit. Extensions are not extras. These are not like browser plugins that make your browser do something it wouldn't do otherwise. Well, they are. That's exactly what they are. But they're not separate from the application. Don't think of them as something that you can overlook. The way the Portswigger team handles extensions with Burp Suite is if there's an extension that does a good job at something, then they are not going to create that same function inside Burp natively. Because why bother? It's already there. They've got other things they got. How long is their list? Anybody been on a dev team? How long is your list of wish list items, right? So if someone's done item 4 on my wish list, I'm just checking it off. Just keep using that. And some of the extensions are written by Portswigger staff. So that should be evidence right there that I'm not just making this up. One of the extensions I'll talk about in a minute is you wouldn't expect it. You wouldn't expect that the vendors of a 4-pay tool would write an extension like this. But how do you find them? There's lots of them. There's if you look here, if the contrast was better, you could see it. But how many extensions are there just in Burp? Well, the little thumb thing is like right there. It's that big. There are over 250 extensions just in this list. And you can also install things manually. People write extensions and put them up on GitHub and they don't make it to the BAP store. They call it the app store. I had no idea how to say that. But there's 250 of them just available in here. So how are you supposed to find ones that are interesting or useful for your particular test that you're on? Well, they added not so long ago a search function. There didn't used to be a search function. You had to scroll through them all and click on them one by one. But my suggestions for extensions, finding good extensions, is you can sort them by popularity. So what are other people using? If it's popular, maybe there's a reason. And if it's popular and it touches on something that's a feature that might be interesting to you, that maybe that's the one you start with. You can separately sort them by rating. You can click stars like everywhere else now. So what are extensions regardless of how popular they are? How much do people love them? And then by last updated, because this thing is updated all the time. This is not part of the Burp installation. Well, it is, but it also gets updated separately. So you don't have to wait for Burp to update itself to get more plugins. They just show up. And there's no other way to know that. They don't tell you, hey, there's new extensions. You have to go and look for them. And then there's searching. So some of the useful extensions that I use or that other folks at Black Hills InfoSec have told me that they use a lot are, there's 2 of these. There's Authorize and Auth Matrix. These are 2 extensions that are fantastic for testing privilege escalation. So if the idea I had earlier about having multiple browser profiles and simultaneous active sessions isn't enough, both of these allow you to automate some of that. Authorize is a little bit easier to understand and set up at first. Auth Matrix is a little bit more thorough, but they both help you test privilege separation. So they're both worth taking the time to figure them out. Auth Matrix, if you're anything like me, was just baffling at first. I had no idea how to make it work. but it's worth the time to figure it out. Upload scanner is one of my favorite ones. If you have a web application with a file upload, like that's like, oh my gosh, I could spend 2 days on just the file upload feature. So can I upload files that you don't expect? Can I upload malicious files? Can I upload executable files? Can I upload files that I can then download? Can I upload files that I can then make the server execute, like a PHP file, and the server is going to give it back to me, but it executes the PHP in that file I uploaded. There's so much stuff that you can do with file upload functionality. And the upload scanner automates a ton of that stuff for you. Like the others, there is some setup you have to do here. It's not just going to work. You have to know what you're looking for. You have to know that there is a file upload and where it is. It helps if you have some idea where that file goes on the server. You can tell it to look in this directory for that file. If you know, if you don't, it's all right, but you won't get as good a results. It goes to, you have to understand the application you're testing first. The tools will help you, but they don't do all the work for you. JSON Web Token Attacker is great for JSON Web Tokens, which is how we do authentication and APIs a lot now. It's got some built-in tests that will tell you if they're using the JWTs in a potentially vulnerable way, and then it's up to you to figure out how to exploit that. So it'll show you if these particular attacks are effective, and then you have to do something useful with them. It won't actually get you good information, it will just tell you that it's possible. Turbo Intruder, this is the one I was talking about before. Turbo Intruder. Intruder is one of the main differences between the community version of Burp Suite and the professional version of Burp Suite. Community version is free, professional is like $400 a year or something. And in the free version, the intruder tool is there, but it's throttled. There's an exponential back off on it. So after every request, it waits twice as long as last time to send the next request. So the community version of Burp Suite is only practically useful for maybe 40 or 50 items in your payload list. Turbo Intruder is a plugin that works in the community version and the pro version. And Turbo is the point. It's meant to go fast. Intruder itself is pretty quick, but speed is not its purpose. This one, basically, speed is the purpose. It helps you find things like timing attacks, time of check, time of use attack type things. And it works in the free version. So if you don't have to do all the extra stuff. You can use it very similarly to the regular built-in intruder in the free version to get that speed and volume without paying for the pro version. And it's written by the same people. They want you to do good, I think. Param Miner helps scan for common problems with parameters. It looks for well-known parameters. It's a handy little extra to just turn on anytime you're doing a vulnerability scan. Can find things you might otherwise miss or take a long time to look for. And then the last thing there is search for Kettle. In the search field, search for Kettle. James Kettle works for Portswigger. He writes a lot of their blogs, does a lot of their research, is wonderful. He knows what he's doing, and he loves to share things. He gives great talks. He finds really cool things and shares everything he knows. So his plugins, just because he wrote it, makes me interested in it. Rule number 5 is to be curious. We kind of started with this, right? But this is the essence of pen testing. This is why we need people to do pen tests that are different people or a different mindset or even a different group than the people who build things. Because you need to be curious about how things don't work. Most of the work that we do in computering, whether that's development or networks or whatever, is making sure that things work like they should. It's up to the pen testers to make sure things don't work like they shouldn't, which is different. So if I'm using Google Cloud and I want to share a document with you, if I click the share link and it gives me a link and I send it to you and you open the link and you got that document, did that work? What if somebody else gets that link? Who tests that? We test that. So be curious. Here's an example of where being curious pays off a crazy ton. In Burp, there's this thing called Inspector. I was watching a talk just recently, just like less than a month ago, and the folks giving that talk are like, that's Inspector, yeah, we don't need Inspector. Inspector tells us stuff we already know. And it kind of does. This shows up any place you see a request or response, and it parses it out for you and shows you bits that are easier to read. So if you have more than one cookie set, for example, and you send a request, all those cookies go on one line, and they're separated with semicolons, and it might wrap. And so it might be hard to see where one cookie stops and where one starts up again. You might not recognize things. It's easy to just kind of glaze over and miss. But here, it parses them out for you and gives you one on each line. There's a cookie with this name, here's the value. A cookie with this name, here's the value. So it's easier to see those, and you can edit them here too. So you don't have to be as careful about where you click in the actual request itself. Same with request headers, response headers, all those things. So when they first added this, that's all it did. It just made it easier to read. And I had the same response to that. I'm like, oh, that's stupid. I've been doing this for 10 years. I don't need somebody to parse that out for me. Like, I'm cooler than that. But then they added this. They added this guy up at the top. Request attributes, protocol, HTTP1 or HTTP2. Suddenly there's something here that is nowhere else. So if you wrote off the inspector and said, oh, that's stupid, I don't need it, you would have missed this. And the presentation I was listening to earlier, they missed this. They said, oh, don't use inspector. What this lets you do is it lets you dynamically change the request to use a different protocol, a whole different protocol. HTTP 1.1 is a text-based protocol. HTTP 2 is binary. HTTP 1 headers end with the character return line feed. HTTP 2, it's binary. There is no character return line feed. So this is a feature that James Kettle used before it was in Burp Suite. He wrote his own tools to do this, to find the problems in HTTP 1.1 versus HTTP 2. He has a blog post called HTTP 2, the sequel is always worse, which I can't recommend highly enough. And what he found in that effort was that not everything speaks the same language. And when you're sending requests to a web server, you're not always talking to the web server. You're talking to things in between you and the web server. So those things might translate. Those things might have different parsing rules. It might be that you can talk HTTP 2 to the load balancer, but it talks HTTP 1.1 to the web server. You'll never see that because you're not part of that conversation. But if you can encapsulate attacks that would make your HTTP 1.1 request invalid, maybe you put a carriage return line feed inside the name of your header or inside the value of your header, which in 1.1 means, no, that's the end of the header. If you put that carriage return line feed in there and then send it as an HTTP 2 request, now the server is going to get a header that has a carriage return line feed in it, which is illegal. Those aren't allowed to happen. What's it going to do? I don't know. But the inspector lets you play with it, lets you try to figure that out. So stay curious about those things. Dan Geer he's one of the silverbacks of InfoSec. He's been around for a long time. He's got just wonderful, messy white hair and a big beard, and he's just so thoughtful. He's one of the people I kind of look up to, and he always ends his talks with this: there's never enough time. We all have so much we have to do. There's so many things on our list, things pulling at us at work and at home, and so it's not nothing that you're here and that you let me take some of your time today. I hope this was worth it for you, and thank you for giving me the chance. Any questions? Do I have time for questions? Any questions? Anyone? Have I written any of my own extensions? Kind of. There's an extension called PyScripter. So you can write extensions in Python without having to know Java, which is a boon. It's way easier to write them in there. So you can do them quickly, kind of one-off things. So in that sense, yes, but also no. Anything else? Yes?
It seems similar to Fiddler. I've used Fiddler. I haven't heard of Burp Suite. Do you know the difference between the tools? Is there a feature set?
Yes, this seems similar to Fiddler was the question. Fiddler is another intercepting HTTP proxy. The difference is that Fiddler is meant more for developers to use for performance type things. It doesn't have the attack tools built in. I have used Fiddler on tests where I've gotten onto a system where I can't install Burp or I can't use it. Fiddler sometimes works where Burp won't work, where there are software restriction policies in place. It's just, it's meant more for performance. It's just not a security focus is the main difference. Anyone else? I will be at the Black Hills InfoSec table a little bit later today with Deb. If you have any other questions, I'd be happy to talk about this. I love this stuff. I've been doing it for a long time, and I can't talk about it enough. So stop by if you have questions. Thanks for coming.